safely say it's stridency deletion and not something like stopping. And if the word stopping and processes is unfamiliar, we'll get there. So this is just kind of foreshadowing, I guess. Okay, so we did place, which is where the sound is made, manner, which is how the sound is made. This is voicing, which is whether or not your vocal folds are vibrating during production of the speech sound. Most of the obstruent sounds, which were these ones here, stops, fricatives, and affricates, most of the obstruents come in voiced and voiceless pairs called cognates. Is that something familiar? So we have, I'll say one and you say the pair. So the voice or the cognate pair to go with K is and P, T, S. Good, I like how you're making the sounds and not the letters. I wanted to be loud enough so you can hear me. CH. Good, okay. And if that was something that you weren't able to do, we will practice those kinds of things. But here's some examples here. So the only way that cognate pairs differ is by voicing. So they have the exact same place and they have the exact same manner, and the only thing that's different is voicing. That's important to know because usually if a child has trouble with one cognate pair, they will very likely have trouble with the other.
So I was going to come and ask you this separately, but maybe other people don't understand either. Like, whenever I try to figure out voiced and voiceless, like every time I try to do it, I still can't figure out what the difference is. Like in maybe when I'm producing it or like hearing it. Like I understand like is voiced or voiceless and is voiced, but like to actually know. Like,
you don't feel the difference?
Both of them have a voice.
Okay. So if you put your hand, have you done that trick? Put your hand here.
Well, and it's a little easier because you actually feel it.
You do really feel it, yeah. With the stops, it's harder because you're not phonating for as long because it's such a short amount of time because it's a short sound. But you wouldn't feel that vibration at all versus and then if you try sh versus sh. And the other thing that I would suggest to be mindful of is during the stops, whenever you're producing stops, to not add a vowel to the end of them. So I always got on teachers' cases about doing that when they're teaching kids how to sound out words. So B doesn't say buh, it says b. And K doesn't say ka, it says k. So just isolate the phoneme by itself. And then you'll really be, because if you're saying ka, you're going to think that it's voiced because you added a voiced vowel. So just isolate the phoneme by itself, just k, k, t, p. Does that help a little bit?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. That's a good question. And it's a very common thing to add that vowel, and it's hard for voiced phonemes to cut it short, but it's really important to try and cut it short, to do b, d. But for voiceless sounds, it's very easy to not add it because then you just stop voicing. T, p, k. Yeah.
So that's what I don't understand. If you aren't able to say voice sounds, then how are you speaking?
So
What does it sound like?
I don't know that I've ever worked with anyone who doesn't make voiced sounds. It's more common as there's a process called pre-vocalic voicing, in which voiceless sounds that come before a vowel become voiced sounds. So it's more the case that voicing will be turned on than it is for voicing to be turned off. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the little guy that we just watched that was really unintelligible, he didn't have any voiceless sounds. So that's part of the reason his speech sounded so kind of crowded and clustered and like almost like a different language, because he was just like da da dee doo 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 da da da, like only D sounds. So it was only a voiced phoneme. So he didn't have any voiceless sounds and no fricatives. So he didn't have that the dynamics in his speech that make it sound like our language. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And with practice it will come, but I know that it's kind of like this really abstract thought. Yeah.
Today, it just made me think of it. And I was working with one boy who has a hard time pronouncing k and g. And so we were just working on initial k sounds. But it was really funny because he gets the sound and he puts his whole body into it. And we were doing computer, and he wasn't voicing, like, computer is actually like this, like, voiced after the k sound comes in, and he couldn't get that. Like, he was like, computer.
Yeah.
computer.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, we're moving on.
Yeah.
No, it's
That's too complex.
I was like,
Yeah.
I don't know, but I
Yeah.
was like, wow, like I don't know how to teach, like voice that.
Yeah. Well, and what's
didn't
tricky, and
understand.
when we get to treatment, we'll talk a lot about different activities and tips for eliciting speech sounds. But the reason why I say it's so important to not add that vowel is because when you start working on speech sounds in isolation with a kid, you usually start in isolation when you're starting from scratch with a kid who normally can't produce the sound. So you don't pair it with the vowel. You're having them literally just go k, k, to try and get the K sound by itself, or p, p, just to get that sound by itself, or if that's the sound, or if that's voice, but just to get that sound by itself. So oftentimes we start by just working on a phoneme in isolation. So, and then the next step is to make it a syllable. So then you would say ka, ki, ku, kai, and then you would add vowels to make it more difficult. Then you would make it a small word, then a longer word, then a phrase. So you would kind of work in this hierarchy. So it's really important to know how to isolate those phonemes, because that's usually kind of where you would start with the kid if they can't do it at all. But even if you're adding a vowel, it makes it difficult for them because it's adding a layer of complexity. So we want to make it as simple as possible, which is usually the phoneme in isolation. So it could be that that particular word was too complex for him, and he just needs to, back down a step, and then he can add it to, when he's ready to that level. Okay, so place, voice, manner, are those things making sense? That's all a good review that is clear. Okay, so these are phonological processes. We'll talk about them more in a little bit. Phonological processes, which we talked about also kind of in the lecture. These are patterns of sound change that affect a class of sounds overall, or the structure of syllables, and how they present themselves in words. These modifications happen during development, like we talked about in the recorded lecture. So it's normal to a certain extent for kids to use a lot of these patterns. And so early on in development, we don't call them phonological processes because that has kind of a negative connotation. So we call them patterns or modifications because it's normal. It's what most typically developing kids do. That's not to say that all typically developing kids have to do all of these patterns to be considered normal. There's some kids who by 18 months have relatively clear speech, or only do a few patterns. But the reason why eventually it becomes a delay or disorder is when we start thinking about how old they are. So if they're 3, that's usually the cut point for a lot of these patterns. We expect most 3-year-olds to start kind of dissolving those patterns over time and acquiring adult-like speech. And these patterns are systematic, and they follow either place or voice or manner or a combination of them. So it's really important to understand place, voice, and manner, which sounds fall into each, how they are related to each other, because when a process affects a class of sounds, it affects all of them. So if it is going to affect all lingua alveolar sounds, it's going to affect all of them. So not just S and Z, but usually T and D and N and L as well. Maybe not, but usually they're all affected. So you need to know what to look for because you need to know what comes in that class.
So would you say that kids with phonological processes usually don't get early intervention? Or because I have a little girl starting and like with a slew of phonological processes, and she did have some early intervention. I'm not exactly sure what kind, but like she was referred to our preschool. She's just turning 3 at the beginning of March.
Yeah.
But
so I think early intervention as far as birth to 3, it's very uncommon to work on articulation. Because if a kid is referred at that age, there's so much development still happening, they usually don't qualify if they're just artic. Which in those cases I do agree with because they're like 2, so there's a lot of things they shouldn't be doing yet, and a lot of things they have plenty of time to acquire. But so it's usually for those kids, if they're being seen from birth to 3, it's usually for language-based things or more severe issues. I would say after 3 to 5, kids are definitely receiving intervention for phonological processes. Yeah, I think they should be, especially depending on what kind of process and how many they have and how intelligible or unintelligible they are. So the average 3-year-old should be, if you were to talk to the average 3-year-old that you didn't know, you should be able to understand that kid's speech about 75% of the time. So if it's less than that, then it's usually indicative of something that probably requires intervention. So globally, I want you to think of phonological processes as an idea and not as this like rule construct that was put into inception with the Big Bang. This is not something that like has existed since the beginning of time. This is something someone came up with after noticing common patterns that kids use in development and then when they have delays or disorders. So it's widely used, and there's nothing wrong with it. I'm not saying we're not going to use it, because we are. But it's more important, in my opinion, to be able to transcribe a child's speech and analyze it for the patterns or features, make an appropriate diagnosis, and then provide treatment. That may include using phonological processes or referencing phonological processes, but my big takeaway is don't get hung up on memorizing what process is what and getting worried about that you don't know what the difference between processes. It's more important if you can transcribe the speech, so you know place, voice, manner. You can look at a kid like that, the D kid, we'll call him David, who had tons and tons of Ds and nothing else, and be able to say, okay, so he's doing voicing, he's doing stop sounds, but he's not doing fricatives or affricates or glides or liquids, and really be able to dissect his speech irrelevant of what he's referring to. I'd much rather you be able to have that skill set than to be able to look at a pattern and say, oh, he's stopping, or oh, he's fronting. Those are skills that are also important, and we will practice those. But globally, these were developed because they came from patterns that were happening, and I want you to be able to notice those patterns. I was going to say something else. I forget. Okay, so a lot of these processes and patterns are based on distinctive features. Is that something you learned about? Okay, so distinctive features it's a plus and minus system of acoustic parameters that their presence or absence defines what the phoneme is. So whether it's a front sound, whether it's a stop sound, whether it's a consonant, whether it has stridency. And so the presence or absence of even one feature defines it from the other. So even voicing can make a difference between two sounds. So p and b are defined from each other by voicing alone. So even if sounds just have one feature that's different, they're still different phonemes. And that's useful information because that can change the meaning of the word. So if we said pat versus bat, that completely changes the meaning of the word with just changing one feature of one sound. And this is, you may have heard of minimal pairs therapy. Maybe you've tried minimal pairs therapy already in clinic. If not, we'll talk about it later when we get to intervention, but it's based on this idea of features, that you're contrasting the features of sounds.
What do you mean by the plus and minus system?
I'm going to show you in a second, yeah. So this chart here is the plus or minus system. So you have all the sounds up here, and then you have all the features that have been recognized in our language. And I don't need you to memorize all of these, but I do need you to at least like have this idea in your head that, like, as an example, you'll see that P and B will have all similar pluses and minuses until you get to voice, and that's where they differ. Everything else is the same. This is a useful chart because as a part of this minimal pairs therapy, there's several different variations of minimal pairs. You can do minimal pairs, which are sounds that differ only by one contrasting phoneme. So you would, if a child can't say the R sound, then you would come up with a list of words that contrast the R sound with the sound they're substituting, which is probably W. So you would say rake, wake, run, one, rhine, wine, those types of things to get them to contrast the sounds. And I think I had a sample of that, but I don't think I put it in this talk. And so what's helpful is you use this chart to determine how similar or how different sounds are from each other. So sometimes it's helpful to use sounds that are very similar to each other that only differ in one feature, but it might also be helpful, and this will make more sense when we get into treatment, it may also be helpful to use a contrast that's incredibly different. So this has plus, minus, 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 minus. So if we found one that was plus, plus, minus, plus, that would be very different. So we could use that for even a greater contrast opportunity for that child. Does that make sense? So this is not something I need you to memorize or like fill out or something, but this is just for your reference for later whenever you're thinking about choosing targets. We often use something like this to say, if we want our sounds to be similar, we can look and see how many features they have in common, or if we want them to be really different from each other, we can look to see how many features they don't have in common. Sorry, that's cut off a little bit there. This is the frequency of occurrence of consonants, again, just for your reference. This is the frequency with which these consonants occur in our language, in our spoken language. And so this is helpful when thinking about which sound might be more useful to target first in therapy. So if you have a child who has errors here, and errors here, and here, and here, you might want to start with these sounds, whatever they are, because they occur frequently in our language. So we have a lot of N's and T's and S's and D's, like, you know, Wheel of Fortune. So these are commonly occurring sounds and letters in our language. So if a child has difficulty with these sounds, they're going to be harder to understand than if they have difficulty with just these sounds. So this is how the phonemes occur in our language naturally, so the frequency of occurrence. So this is one thing to consider whenever you're thinking about planning treatment for these kids. And I know I'm already talking about treatment, and we'll actually talk about treatment in depth later, but it's kind of helpful to start thinking about why these early things are important to remember and to learn and to think about. So in the recorded lecture, I talked about developmental norms being one piece of data that you could take into consideration and whenever you're deciding whether or not a child qualifies and whether you're trying to decide which sounds to work on. This is another piece of data. So you would talk about, you know, how old are they and should they have this sound? That's just one thing you take into consideration. It's not the be-all, end-all rule. This is another piece of information you take into consideration. Again, not the be-all, end-all rule, but you do want to take it into consideration because it can greatly affect intelligibility. Oopsie, look at that. This is an example of a developmental norms chart. So you'll see a lot of these kinds of things hovering around Pinterest and all that kind of stuff, like in the form of trees and other ridiculous things. I suggest just going to the research literature that you have access to and find out what they say instead of what you know, Speech Mom says on Pinterest. But this is an example of a way we can represent developmental norms. And so where the line ends here is suggested that 75% of kids can accurately produce this sound by that age, by where the color line ends. So by 3 years of age, we expect all kids to be able to produce these sounds. By 4 years, all of these sounds. And then you'll notice that for and most R sounds, that's the one that goes the longest. So there's some research saying that they don't even quite get to 100% until 9 or so, which is what the Smith et al. Article that you read suggested. And there's mixed literature on that. So there's a lot of folks who say that R is an easier sound to acquire and that kids can acquire it by 3. Some people say by 6, and some people say by 9. So that's a really huge discrepancy, and you guys had a great discussion on the discussion board about how do you even decide. So if one person who's writing a research article is saying 3, and one person is saying 6, and one person is saying 9, how do you decide? And there's a lot of factors to consider. So this is not the be-all, end-all. So it's not the case that a kid who's 6 who can't produce R shouldn't be seen until 8 just because this particular chart tells you to. You would take into consideration a lot of other features. How intelligible is he? He can have one sound in error and still be difficult to understand because it can present itself on a wide variety of ways, kind of along a spectrum. R is also a really interesting sound because it has a few vocalic presentations and lots of cluster presentations. So it can occur initial, medial, and final positions of words. And in the final positions of words, it occurs vocalically, like AR, R is a different sound than or, is a different sound than air, is a different sound than ear. And so you'll have some kids who may be able to do some of those vocalic R's, but not others. And so R is a really complex sound. And this is my favorite representation of how difficult R is. Do you guys watch The Office?
It is grotty.
Whoa.
Oh no.
Oh, that is what?
Why is this happening?
You guys are familiar with The Office? Why isn't it showing up? I thought I fixed it.
What, job?
I'm so sorry, you guys. This is really frustrating. I think we finished it. I can do this. No, it's like moving on. Okay, ready?
Gotti, you idiot.
It's a completely different name. So he won't get caught.
Yeah, pretty close.
What are you talking about? What mobster would change his name from Gotti to Grotti? It weakens it.
No, I disagree. R is among the most menacing of sounds. That's what they call it, murder, and not muck duck.
Okay, too many words coming at me from too many different sentences.
Lock your door.
I'm not gonna lock my door.
So it's the most menacing of sounds, which also contributes to why it's just so difficult. Isn't that hilarious? I saw that on one of the episodes. I'm like, oh my god, I have to find that on YouTube. Okay, So that's consonants in a nutshell. Here's vowels. So these are 2 words you'll see. You've probably seen before: monophthongs, 1 vowel sound; diphthongs, 2 vowel sounds. And this is